Good evening. My name is Cole, and tonight I'll be reading 10 short but deeply unsettling stories. Strange encounters that blur the line between memory, reality, and something else entirely. From a substitute teacher who never existed to a birthday party nobody remembers, these are the stories that leave you questioning what's real and what isn't. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's start with our first story. This one comes from someone who experienced something at school that still haunts them years later. Sometimes the most ordinary situations turn out to be anything but ordinary. When I was in 8th grade, our regular English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, went on maternity leave right before winter break. The principal told us we'd have a substitute until she returned after New Year's. That's when we met Mr. Green. He was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a soft voice that made you lean forward to hear him. Mr. Green had this way of teaching that was different from any substitute we'd ever had. He knew our curriculum better than most of our regular teachers, and he seemed to genuinely care about our progress. He'd stay after class to help struggling students, and he had this incredible knowledge of literature that went way beyond our textbooks. What struck me most was how he remembered all our names by the second day. Not just our first names, but our last names too. He'd call on us with this gentle smile and say things like, "Sarah Mitchell, what do you think about the symbolism here?" Or, "David Hernandez, can you elaborate on that point?" It was impressive, especially since most substitutes just pointed at you and said, "You in the blue shirt." Mr. Green had personal touches in the classroom too. He brought in his own coffee mug, a navy blue one with some kind of academic insignia on it. He hung a small calendar behind the desk and marked off each day with a red pen. He even brought in a small plant, a spider plant that he'd water every morning before class started. These weren't things a typical short-term substitute would do. During that week, he taught us about Edgar Allan Poe in a way that made the stories come alive. He dimmed the lights slightly and read passages in this haunting voice that gave us all chills. He introduced us to poems we hadn't covered yet, and he seemed to know exactly which stories would captivate our attention. When he read The Telltale Heart, you could hear a pin drop in that classroom. On Friday, his last day, Mr. Green gave us a writing assignment. He wanted us to write our own mysterious short story over the break. He said he was looking forward to reading them when we came back from vacation. He even wrote his feedback expectations on the board and told us he'd have our stories graded and returned within a week of our return. The weird thing was how he said goodbye. Instead of the usual, "have a good break," that substitutes typically gave, Mr. Green shook each of our hands as we left class. He looked us in the eyes and said something personal to each student. When it was my turn, he said, "Keep writing, Emma. You have a gift for storytelling that shouldn't be wasted." I remember feeling proud that he'd noticed my writing. Over winter break, I actually worked hard on that story assignment. I wanted to impress Mr. Green with something really creative. I spent hours crafting this tale about a music box that played different melodies depending on the listener's deepest fear. I was excited to turn it in and see what kind of feedback he'd give me. When we returned from vacation in January, Mrs. Patterson was back. She looked great, glowing with that new mother happiness, and she had pictures of her baby to show anyone who was interested. But I was disappointed that I wouldn't get to turn in my story to Mr. Green or get his feedback. During lunch that day, I went to the main office to ask if I could get Mr. Green's contact information so I could email him my story. The secretary, Mrs. Williams, looked at me with confusion when I mentioned his name. "Mr. Green," she said, flipping through some papers on her desk. "What subject did he teach?" "English," I told her. "He was Mrs. Patterson's substitute for the week before break." Mrs. Williams pulled out a thick binder and started flipping through pages. She frowned as she searched, then looked up at me with a puzzled expression. "Honey, we didn't have any substitute named Mr. Green," she said. Mrs. Patterson's substitute was Miss Rodriguez. She covered the class for that entire week. I insisted that wasn't right. I described Mr. Green in detail, told her about his coffee mug, his plant, the way he taught Poe stories. Mrs. Williams called over the principal, Mr. Davis, who had been passing by the office. "Mr. Davis," I said, "you introduced us to our substitute, Mr. Green, remember? The tall man with glasses who taught our English class?" Mr. Davis shook his head slowly. "I introduced you to Miss Rodriguez. She's a young woman, been substituting for us for about 3 years now. There's never been a Mr. Green on our substitute list. They showed me the official records. Miss Rodriguez had signed in every day that week. Her lesson plans were filed properly. There were even notes in her handwriting about our class progress, but I had never seen this woman before in my life. I went back to my English classroom after lunch hoping to find some evidence of Mr. Green's presence. His coffee mug was gone. The calendar he'd hung up wasn't there. Even the spider plant had vanished. The desk looked exactly like it always had when Mrs. Patterson was there. I asked my classmates about Mr. Green. The responses I got chilled me to the bone. Some of them looked at me like I was crazy and insisted we'd had Miss Rodriguez all week. But others, about half the class, remembered Mr. Green exactly as I did. They remembered his voice, his teaching style, the way he'd made Poe's stories come alive. The strange thing was, those of us who remembered Mr. Green couldn't agree on every detail. Some swore his coffee mug was blue, others said it was green. Some remembered him as tall and thin, others described him as average height with a stockier build. But we all remembered the core experience of having him as our teacher. The students who remembered Miss Rodriguez had completely different memories of that week. They talked about her energetic teaching style, her colourful scarves, the way she'd written vocabulary words in purple marker on the board. Their memories were just as vivid and detailed as ours, but completely different. Mrs. Patterson was concerned when we brought this up to her. She called the office to double-check the substitute records. Everything showed that Miss Rodriguez had been our teacher that week. There was no paperwork for anyone named Mr. Green. No background check, no contract, no payment records. I kept the short story I'd written for Mr. Green's assignment. Sometimes I'd read it and remember how excited I'd been to turn it into him, to get his feedback. I'd remember his encouragement about my writing talent, the way he'd looked me in the eyes and told me not to waste my gift. Years later, when I was in college studying education, I decided to investigate this mystery more thoroughly. I contacted the school district's HR department and asked them to search their records for any substitute teacher named Mr. Green, who might have worked during that time period. They searched going back 10 years. No Mr. Green had ever been employed by the district in any capacity. I reached out to the classmates who remembered him, the ones who'd experienced the same week I had. Some of them still remembered every detail clearly. Others had started to doubt their own memories, wondering if maybe we'd all somehow convinced ourselves that this person existed. But I know what I experienced. I know Mr. Green was real. I can still hear his voice reading Poe's stories in that darkened classroom. I can still see him watering that spider plant every morning. I can still feel the firm handshake he gave me on that Friday afternoon and hear his words of encouragement about my writing. The question that haunts me isn't whether Mr. Green existed. It's why only half of us remember him and why there's no trace of him in any official records. Who was he and where did he come from? More importantly, where did he go? And why did he choose to teach us for just 1 week before disappearing completely? That whole experience fundamentally changed how I think about reality and memory. It made me question whether the things we experience are always as solid and permanent as we believe them to be. Well, that's genuinely unsettling. The idea that someone could just slip in and out of reality like that, leaving half the class with completely different memories, makes you question everything. What's even more disturbing is that the substitute records show a completely different person was there all week. Either this is some kind of shared delusion, or something far stranger happened in that classroom. The detail about the poster's writing assignment and Mr. Green's encouragement feels so personal and real, which makes the whole thing even more chilling. Our next story takes us to a playground where childhood games took a very dark turn. Sometimes the things we dare each other to do as kids open doors that should stay closed. The playground game that went too far. When you're a kid, playground dares feel like the most important thing in the world. You do whatever it takes to prove you're brave enough, cool enough, or just desperate enough to fit in. I was 10 years old when this happened, and I was the new kid at Jefferson Elementary. Moving to a new town in the middle of 4th grade was rough enough, but being the weird kid who kept to himself made it even worse. I spent most recesses sitting alone on the monkey bars, watching the other kids play their games and wishing I had the courage to join them. There was this group of kids who always hung around the old swing set in the far corner of the playground. They were led by this girl named Cassie, who had this way of making everything sound like life or death. She'd dare kids to do things like eat dirt or climb the chain link fence or steal chalk from Mrs. Henderson's classroom. Most of the time I avoided them, but on this particular Tuesday, they cornered me. "Hey, new kid," Cassie called out as I was walking to my usual spot. "You want to play a game with us?" I knew I should have said no and walked away, but the thought of finally being included was too tempting. I nodded and followed them over to the swing set. The swings were ancient, the kind with heavy metal chains that squeaked when the wind blew through them. The seats were cracked rubber that'd been there probably since the school opened. None of the kids ever actually swung on them because they were too old and creaky. but they made the perfect meeting spot for dares and secrets. "We're going to teach you the shadow game," Cassie announced, like she was letting me in on some great mystery. The other kids, maybe 6 or 7 of them, formed a circle around me. They all had this excited look in their eyes, like they knew something I didn't. "What's the shadow game?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You stand in the middle of the swings," explained a boy named Marcus, "and you have to say this special rhyme 3 times, but you have to say it exactly right, or it doesn't work." "What happens if it works?" I asked. Cassie grinned. "You'll see, but you have to promise to do it exactly like we tell you. No chickening out halfway through." I agreed, even though every instinct I had was telling me to run, but I wanted so badly to be part of something, to have kids actually want to talk to me, that I ignored the warning bells in my head. They positioned me right in the center of the 3 swings. The chains hung down on either side of me, like metal curtains. The other kids backed away until they formed a wide circle around the swing set, all watching me with eager faces. "Okay," Cassie called out. "You have to close your eyes and say this rhyme 3 times, and you can't open your eyes until you're completely finished, no matter what happens." She taught me the rhyme. It was simple enough, just 4 lines that didn't really make much sense. "Shadow children, come and play, swing with me until the day. When the sun goes down to rest, I'll be yours and you'll be blessed." It sounded harmless, like something from a nursery rhyme book. I asked them where they learned it, and Marcus said his older brother had taught it to him. Cassie added that kids had been doing this game at this playground for years. I closed my eyes and started the first recitation. My voice shook a little at first, but by the second line I felt more confident. The other kids were silent, which made my voice seem louder than it actually was. I finished the first round and started the second. That's when I felt the first gust of wind. It wasn't unusual for it to be windy on the playground, but this felt different. It came from directly behind me, like someone had blown air on the back of my neck. I kept my eyes closed and continued with the rhyme. During the second recitation, I started hearing sounds. Not the other kids, they were still silent. These were different sounds, like whispers just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out words, but there were definitely voices mixed in with the wind. By the time I started the third and final recitation, the whispers had gotten louder. They sounded like children's voices, but there was something wrong with them. They overlapped each other in a way that made it impossible to understand what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, almost excited. I finished the rhyme and opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was that all 3 swings were moving, not swaying gently in the breeze, but actually swinging back and forth like invisible children were pumping their legs. The chains creaked rhythmically, and the rubber seats moved in perfect arcs. The second thing I noticed was that the other kids were gone. Not just backed away further, completely gone. I was standing alone in the middle of the playground, with 3 empty swings moving by themselves around me. I spun in a circle, looking for Cassie and Marcus and the others, but the entire playground was deserted. I ran toward the school building, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But when I reached the door, I found it was locked. Through the windows, I could see that the hallways were dark. There were no lights on anywhere in the building. I ran back toward the swing set, thinking maybe the other kids were hiding, and this was all part of some elaborate prank. But the swings were still moving, and now I could hear the whispers again. They were clearer now, and I realized they weren't speaking English. The words sounded old, like they came from a different time entirely. I looked around the playground and noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were shadows moving across the ground, but there was nothing casting them. They moved like children running and playing, but when I looked up, there was nothing there. The shadows started gathering around the swing set, and that's when I ran. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, straight off the playground and down the street toward my house. I didn't stop until I was inside with the door locked behind me. When I looked at the clock, it was almost 4:30 in the afternoon. I had started the game during morning recess, which ended at 10:15. I had lost over 6 hours. When I went back to school the next day, I found Cassie and demanded to know what had happened. She looked at me like I was crazy. "What game?" she asked. "I don't know what you're talking about." I described everything in detail, the rhyme, the circle of kids, the positioning by the swing set. Cassie just shook her head. "We never talked to you yesterday," she said. "You spent recess sitting by yourself like you always do." I asked Marcus and the other kids who had been there. Every single one of them gave me the same response. They had no memory of teaching me any rhyme or gathering around the swing set. According to them, I'd spent both morning and afternoon recess sitting alone. But I knew what had happened, and I avoided that swing set for the rest of the school year. Years school, I was later. When I was in high, helping my mum clean out some old boxes in the basement, when I found a newspaper clipping from the 1950s. The headline read, 3 children vanish from Jefferson Elementary Playground. The article described how 3 students had disappeared during recess one Tuesday afternoon. They were last seen playing near the old swing set. The children were never found. I never told anyone about finding that newspaper clipping, and I never went back to that playground again. That story hits different when you realize the poster might have been playing with the spirits of those missing children from the 1950s. The fact that 6 hours went missing and nobody remembered the game suggests something far more sinister than a simple playground dare. Those shadows, moving without anything to cast them, and the whispers in an unknown language, make it clear that whatever the poster awakened that day had been waiting a long time for someone to say that rhyme. The newspaper clipping just confirms that this playground has a dark history of making children disappear. Our next story comes from someone who learned that sometimes strangers ask questions that seem innocent, but hide much darker intentions. I was 22 and living in my first apartment after college when this happened. It was one of those old buildings where you had to go to the basement to do your laundry, and I always dreaded those trips down there. The laundry room was this dingy space with flickering fluorescent lights and the constant smell of detergent mixed with something musty that I could never identify. It was a Thursday night, around 9 o'clock, when I hauled my basket of dirty clothes downstairs. I preferred doing laundry late because the room was usually empty, and I could get everything done without having to wait for machines or make awkward small talk with neighbors I barely knew. The laundry room had 6 washing machines and 6 dryers lined up against opposite walls. Only one other person was there when I walked in, an older woman I'd never seen before. She looked to be in her 60s, with grey hair pulled back in a tight bun, and wearing a faded floral dress that seemed too formal for doing laundry. She was sitting on one of the plastic chairs against the wall, not doing anything, just watching her clothes tumble in the dryer. What struck me as odd was that she didn't have a laundry basket or detergent with her. She was just sitting there with her hands folded in her lap. I nodded politely and started loading my clothes into one of the washers. The woman watched me the entire time, which made me uncomfortable, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe she was just bored and looking for someone to talk to. When I finished loading the washer and adding detergent, the woman spoke up. "Excuse me, dear," she said in a voice that was soft but somehow unsettling. "Do you like the smell of smoke?" It was such a random question that I wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. I turned to face her, and she was staring at me with these pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked. "The smell of smoke," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "Do you find it pleasant?" I thought maybe she was asking because she wanted to smoke and was wondering if it would bother me. Some of the older residents in the building still smoked, despite the no smoking policy. "Not really," I told her. "I don't smoke, and the smell usually gives me headaches." She nodded slowly, like my answer was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "That's interesting," she said. "Most people don't appreciate the smell until they have to." Before I could ask what she meant by that, she stood up and walked over to the dryer. She opened it and pulled out a small load of clothes, mostly dark colors. But here's the thing that still bothers me. The dryer hadn't been running. I would have heard it, and there was no heat coming from inside when she opened the door. She folded her clothes quickly and efficiently, then put them in a canvas bag that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I hadn't seen her carrying it when I walked in. "Have a good evening, dear," she said as she headed toward the door. "And remember what I said about the smoke." After she left, I realized I'd been holding my breath. There was something about her presence that had made the entire room feel smaller and more oppressive. I finished setting up my wash and decided to come back later for my clothes instead of waiting around in that basement. I went back upstairs to my apartment and tried to forget about the weird encounter. I made myself some dinner and watched TV, but I kept thinking about the woman's question and her comment about people not appreciating smoke until they have to. What did that even mean? Around 11 o'clock, I went back downstairs to move my clothes to the dryer. The laundry room was empty now, but something felt different. There was a faint smell in the air that I couldn't identify at first. It wasn't the usual musty odor or detergent smell. It was smoke, not cigarette smoke, but something else. something that reminded me of burning wood, but with an acrid undertone that made my nose wrinkle. I looked around the room, but couldn't find any source for the smell. None of the machines were overheating, and there was no visible smoke anywhere. I quickly moved my clothes to the dryer and got out of there as fast as I could. Back in my apartment, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but I couldn't stop thinking about that woman. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. I went to bed around midnight, still feeling unsettled. I was jolted awake at 3:17 in the morning by the piercing shriek of my smoke alarm. I sat up in bed, immediately wide awake and terrified. The alarm was coming from the kitchen, and I could smell smoke drifting down the hallway. I grabbed my phone and called 911 while rushing toward the kitchen to see what was wrong. The kitchen was filled with smoke, but I couldn't see any flames. The smoke seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was the same acrid smell I'd noticed in the laundry room, but much stronger now. The fire department arrived within minutes, and they searched my entire apartment with thermal imaging cameras and smoke detectors. They found no source of fire, no electrical problems, no gas leaks, nothing that could have caused the smoke. But they confirmed that there had definitely been smoke in my kitchen. The residue was on the walls and ceiling, and the smell lingered for days afterward. The fire chief was baffled. "It's like the smoke just appeared out of nowhere," he told me. "I've never seen anything like it." I didn't mention the woman from the laundry room. How could I explain that a stranger had asked me about smoke? And then, hours later, my apartment had filled with mysterious smoke that had no source. I asked around the building about the woman I'd met in the laundry room, describing her to several neighbors. None of them had ever seen anyone matching her description. The building manager told me that all the residents were accounted for, and no one fitting that description lived in the building. I started doing my laundry at a different time, avoiding the evening hours when I'd met her. But about a week later, I ran into Mrs. Chen from the 4th floor in the lobby. She asked me if I was okay, said she'd heard about the fire department coming to my apartment. When I explained what had happened, Mrs. Chen got very quiet. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. "You know," she said, "the woman who lived in your apartment before you died in a fire. It was about 2 years ago. She was an older lady, kept the fire started in the to herself mostly. Kitchen in the middle of the night. They never figured out what caused it. I asked her to describe the woman, and her description matched the person I'd met in the laundry room exactly. Grey hair in a bun, pale blue eyes, always wore floral dresses." Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone and showed me a picture from a building newsletter memorial. It was the same woman who had asked me about the smell of smoke. I moved out of that apartment the following month. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to warn me about something, or maybe trying to recreate the circumstances of her own death. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. The night before I moved, I went down to the laundry room one last time. I wanted to see if she would appear again, to try to understand what she wanted. But the room was empty, and it stayed empty the entire time I was there. As I was leaving, I noticed something I'd never seen before. On the wall next to the door, someone had written, in faded pencil, "The smell always comes first." I don't know if it was a warning or a threat, but I was glad to be leaving. That encounter with the dead woman is absolutely chilling, especially when you realize she was trying to warn the poster or recreate her own death. The detail about the smoke appearing with no source, and then learning that the previous tenant died in an unexplained fire, suggests that some spirits are bound to repeat the circumstances of their death. The message on the wall, "The smell always comes first," feels like a warning left by someone who understood what was happening. At least the poster was smart enough to get out before history repeated itself. Let's move on to our next story, about a discovery at work that revealed something disturbing about the building's past. This next story comes from someone who made an unsettling discovery in the most disturbing mysteries their office building. Sometimes, a hiding behind doors we walk past every day. I've been working at Harrison & Associates for about 8 months when I found the room. It was a typical mid-size accounting firm, housed in one of those bland office buildings from the 70s, all beige carpeting and fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. I knew the layout pretty well by then, or so I thought. It was a Friday evening, and I was staying late to finish up some quarterly reports that were due Monday morning. Most of my co-workers had already left for the weekend, and the building had that hollow, echoing quality it gets when it's mostly empty. I was heading to the break room to grab another coffee when I decided to take a different route through the building. Instead of going down the main hallway, like I usually did, I turned left past the conference rooms and walked down a corridor I rarely used. That's when I noticed a door I'd never seen before. It was just a plain wooden door with no nameplate or number, positioned between two supply closets at the end of the hallway. What caught my attention was that it looked older than the other doors in the building. The wood was darker, and the handle was this old-fashioned brass knob instead of the modern silver handles on every other door. I tried the knob, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door opened into a large room that was nothing like the rest of our office. It was set up like a classroom from maybe the 1960s or 70s. There were about 15 wooden desks arranged in neat rows, each with an attached chair and a small cubbyhole underneath. A larger desk sat at the front of the room facing the others, with a green chalkboard mounted on the wall behind it. But what made the room unsettling was how everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, like it had been abandoned suddenly and left undisturbed for decades. Papers were scattered across the desks, as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. Pencils lay where they'd been dropped, and there were even coffee cups sitting on some of the desks, though whatever had been in them had long since evaporated, leaving only dark stains at the bottom. I walked into the room, my footsteps muffled by the dust on the linoleum floor. The air smelled stale and musty, like a basement that hadn't been opened in years. I approached one of the desks and picked up one of the papers scattered across its surface. It was a memo dated March 15th, 1987, addressed to something called the Special Projects Division. The memo was about budget allocations for what it called behavioral research initiatives. Most of the text was bureaucratic jargon, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Subject compliance monitoring, environmental manipulation protocols, and long-term psychological assessment. I moved to another desk and found more papers with similar dates, all from 1987. There were employee schedules, research notes, and what looked like observation reports. The observation reports were the most disturbing. They contained detailed descriptions of people's daily routines, their habits, their relationships, even their fears and anxieties. It was like someone had been conducting intensive surveillance and psychological profiling. One report caught my attention because it mentioned the building we were in. It described Phase 3 implementation at this address, involving something called ambient influence testing. The report mentioned installing monitoring equipment and environmental controls throughout the building. I found a folder on the teacher's desk labeled Project Oversight. Inside were photographs, black and white pictures of people in what looked like office settings. But these weren't normal workplace photos. The people in the pictures looked uncomfortable, stressed, like they were being photographed without their knowledge. Some of the photos seemed to be taken through windows or from hidden positions. There were also floor plans of our building, but they showed rooms and spaces that didn't exist in the current layout. According to these plans, there should have been additional rooms behind the walls, observation areas with one-way glass, and what the plans labelled as monitoring stations. The most disturbing thing I found was a thick binder filled with individual profiles. Each profile contained a photograph, personal information, and detailed behavioural assessments of what appeared to be office workers. The assessments tracked everything from productivity levels to stress responses to what the reports called compliance indicators. As I flipped through the profiles, I realised with growing horror that some of the people in the photographs looked familiar. Not people I knew personally, but faces that seemed like they could be relatives of my current co-workers. The bone structure, the facial features, even some of the names were similar to people I worked with every day. I found a calendar on the wall showing March 1987, with several dates circled in red. One of the circled dates had a note written next to it. Final phase implementation, all subjects. The note was dated March 18th, 1987. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a desk in the back corner that was different from the others. Instead of papers and office supplies, it had monitoring equipment on it. Old television screens, recording devices, and what looked like audio equipment. The screens were dark, but when I got closer, I could see that they were connected to cables that disappeared into the walls. I followed one of the cables along the baseboard and discovered that it led to a small hole drilled through the wall. When I put my ear to the hole, I could hear the faint sound of typing and office conversation coming from the other side. It was coming from our current office space. The room I'd found wasn't just abandoned. It was a monitoring station that had been set up to observe and record the activities of everyone working in the building. I quickly took photos of some of the documents with my phone, then got out of that room as fast as I could. Back at my desk, I tried to research the history of our building. but I couldn't find any information about a special projects division or any behavioral research being conducted here. Over the weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd discovered. On Monday morning, I went back to that hallway to take another look at the room, but the door was not locked or painted over. It was completely gone. Where the door had been, there was just a blank wall that looked like it had been there for decades. I asked around the office about the building's history, trying to be casual about it. Most of my co-workers had no idea what the building had been used for before our company moved in. But one of the older employees, Margaret, who'd been with the company for over 20 years, pulled me aside. "You know," she said quietly, "I've always felt like someone was watching us in this building. Like there were eyes on you, even when you were alone. I thought I was just being paranoid." She told me that several employees over the years had mentioned feeling uncomfortable in certain parts of the building, especially near that hallway where I'd found the door. Some people had reported hearing voices through the walls, or feeling like they were being observed when no one else was around. There was this one guy, worked here about 10 years ago, Margaret continued. He swore he could hear recording equipment running in the walls. Management thought he was having some kind of breakdown and eventually let him go. But now that you mention it, he might have been onto something. I never found that room again, even though I searched every hallway and tried every door in the building. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm working alone, I can hear faint sounds coming from inside the walls, the soft whir of machinery, the click of recording equipment, and occasionally, the sound of footsteps in spaces that shouldn't exist. I still work there, but I've never felt comfortable in that building again. And sometimes I wonder if whatever research was being conducted in 1987 never really ended. Maybe it just went underground, literally, and the observation continues from spaces we can't see. The most unsettling thought is this: what if we're all still subjects in an experiment that never officially ended? That story is absolutely terrifying, because it suggests the poster stumbled upon evidence of a long-term psychological experiment that might still be ongoing. The fact that the door completely disappeared after the weekend indicates that whoever was behind the original research is still monitoring the building. Those observation reports and behavioral assessments from 1987 weren't just historical documents. They were templates for something that continues today. The idea that office workers have been unknowing test subjects for decades is the kind of conspiracy nightmare that feels all too plausible in our surveillance-heavy world. Our next story takes us back to childhood, where sometimes the most vivid memories turn out to be the most mysterious ones. I need to tell someone about my 6th birthday party because it's driving me crazy and I don't know who else would believe me. The problem is that according to my mum, the party never happened. I remember everything about that day so clearly, it's like it happened yesterday. I woke up that Saturday morning to balloons tied to the foot of my bed, red and blue ones that bobbed against the ceiling when the air conditioning kicked on. Mum had made my favourite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, and she'd put a candle in the biggest one for me to blow out. The party was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. I remember because I kept checking the clock in the kitchen, watching the hands move slowly toward party time. I was so excited I could barely sit still. Mom had invited 6 kids from my kindergarten class, and she'd promised we'd have games and prizes and a real magician. But the magician wasn't what I expected. Instead of the cheerful guy in a colourful costume that I'd imagined, the person who showed up at our door was a clown. He was tall and thin, wearing a traditional white clown outfit with big red buttons and oversized shoes. His face was painted white, with a red smile and black triangles around his eyes. What I remember most about the clown was his voice. It was soft and whispery, not the loud, boisterous voice you'd expect from a children's entertainer. When he talked to us kids, he would lean down close and speak so quietly that we had to gather around him to hear what he was saying. The clown did magic tricks, but they weren't the usual rabbit out of a hat or card tricks. He made things disappear completely. He'd take a toy from one of the kids, wave his hand over it, and it would vanish, without any flourish or explanation of where it went. When the kids asked for their toys back, he'd just smile and move on to the next trick. But the strangest part of the clown's performance was when he took pictures. He had this old Polaroid camera, and he insisted on taking a picture of each child individually. He'd pose us in specific ways, always with our hands folded and our heads tilted slightly to the left. The pictures developed right there, and he'd shake them and show them to us before tucking them into a small black bag he carried. I remember being excited about getting copies of those pictures to keep, but when I asked the clown about it, he just whispered, "These are for my collection." After the clown finished his performance, Mom brought out the birthday cake. It was exactly what I'd asked for. a chocolate cake shaped like a castle with 6 candles on the towers. We sang happy birthday, I made a wish and blew out the candles, and then Mum cut slices for everyone. The cake tasted strange though. Not bad, just different from any chocolate cake I'd ever had. It had this metallic aftertaste that lingered in my mouth long after I finished eating. A couple of the other kids mentioned it too, but Mum said it was probably just the food colouring she'd used to make the frosting purple. After cake, we played party games. Pin the tail on the donkey, musical chairs, and hide and seek. But the games felt different from normal party games. During hide and seek, the clown was always the seeker, and he had this way of finding kids that seemed impossible. He'd walk directly to wherever someone was hiding, even in places where there was no way he could have seen them go. During musical chairs, the clown controlled the music, but instead of using a normal stereo, he had this small music box that played the most haunting melody I'd ever heard. When the music stopped, it didn't just fade out. It cut off abruptly with this sharp, discordant note that made all of us kids wince. The party ended around 5 o'clock, and I remember hugging each of my friends goodbye as their parents picked them up. The clown was the last to leave, and before he went, he knelt down next to me and whispered, "Thank you for a wonderful party. I'll never forget you." That night, I was so excited about the party that I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about all the fun we'd had and looking forward to seeing the pictures the clown had taken. Mom had promised we'd get copies developed at the Photoshop the next week. But when Monday came and I started telling kids at school about my party, none of them knew what I was talking about. Jenny, who I clearly remembered being there and winning musical chairs, looked at me like I was crazy when I mentioned it. "I wasn't at any party," she said. "I was at my grandma's house all weekend." I asked the other kids who I remembered being there, and they all gave me similar responses. None of them had any memory of coming to my house or meeting a clown or eating castle cake. When I got home from school, I asked Mom about the pictures from the party. She looked confused and asked me what pictures I was talking about. "From my birthday party on Saturday," I said. "The clown took pictures of all of us with his Polaroid camera." Mom sat down next to me with this concerned look on her face. "Sweetie," she said gently, "we didn't have a party on Saturday. We just had a quiet birthday dinner, just you and me. Remember? We ordered pizza and watched movies." I insisted that wasn't right. I described everything in detail, the decorations, the clown, the cake, the games, all of it. But Mom just shook her head. "I think you might have had a very vivid dream," she said. "Sometimes dreams can feel so real that we think they actually happened, but I knew it wasn't a dream. I could still taste that metallic cake, still hear that haunting music box melody in my head. I could remember the feeling of the clown's gloved hand on my shoulder, and the sound of his whispery voice. I went to my room and looked for any evidence of the party. The balloons that had been tied to my bed were gone. There were no party favors, no cake, no leftover decorations, no crumbs in the kitchen. It was like the party had never happened. Over the next few days, I kept bringing it up with Mom, trying to convince her that the party was real. I described the clown's costume, the magic tricks, even the specific way he posed us for pictures. But the more I talked about it, the more worried Mum became. She took me to see our family doctor, who said that sometimes children create elaborate fantasy scenarios that feel completely real to them. He said it was normal and that I would probably forget about it as I got older, but I never forgot. Even now, 25 years later, I can remember every detail of that birthday party. I can still see the clown's painted face, still hear his whispered voice, still taste that strange cake. A few years ago, I was going through some old family photos when I found something that made my heart stop. It was a picture of me on my 6th birthday, sitting at our kitchen table with a slice of cake in front of me. But it wasn't the castle cake I remembered. It was just a regular chocolate cake with 6 normal candles. And in the background of the photo, barely visible, was the edge of something white. When I looked closer with a magnifying glass, I could make out what looked like the corner of a clown costume. Mum swears she doesn't remember taking that picture, and she has no idea how a clown costume ended up in the background. But there it is, captured in a photograph that proves at least part of my memory was real. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. Was it a dream that somehow left physical evidence? Was it real, but erased from everyone else's memory? Or is there something more sinister at work? All I know is that sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that music box melody playing somewhere in the distance. And I wonder if somewhere out there, a clown in white makeup is looking through a collection of Polaroid pictures, remembering a birthday party that officially never happened. The story is deeply unsettling because it suggests that either reality itself was altered or the poster experienced something so traumatic that everyone's memories were somehow erased. The detail about the clown collecting pictures and saying they were for my collection is particularly chilling, especially when combined with the mysterious white costume edge in the family photo. The fact that none of the other children remember attending, despite the poster's incredibly detailed memories, points to something far more sinister than a simple childhood fantasy. That music box melody, still playing in the distance, suggests that whatever happened that day left a permanent mark on reality. Our next story comes from someone whose late-night commute took an unexpected and frightening turn. I work the overnight shift at a data processing center on the outskirts of town, which means I take the last train home every night at around 2:30 in the morning. It's not ideal, but the pay is decent, and I don't mind the quiet commute. Usually there are only a handful of other passengers at that hour, mostly other night shift workers like me heading home after a long day. The train I take is one of those older models with the faded blue seats and flickering overhead lights. It makes the same stops every night, and I've gotten used to the rhythm, the way the car rocks gently as it moves down the tracks. Most nights, I just put in my headphones and doze until I reach my stop. But this particular Tuesday night was different. When I boarded the train, it was more crowded than usual. Almost every seat was taken, which was strange for that time of night. The passengers looked normal enough. People in work clothes, a few in scrubs like they were coming off hospital shifts. Some teenagers who looked like they'd been out too late. I found an empty seat toward the back of the car and settled in for the 40-minute ride home. The train pulled away from the station with its usual mechanical groaning, and I closed my eyes, ready to catch a few minutes of sleep. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, we were slowing down for the first stop. I opened my eyes and looked around the car. Something was wrong, but it took me a moment to figure out what it was. All the other passengers were gone. Not just a few of them, all of them. Every seat that had been occupied when I boarded was now empty. The only other person in the entire car was an elderly man sitting near the front, wearing a long, dark coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. I checked my watch. We'd only been traveling for about 10 minutes, but somehow everyone else had vanished without me hearing them leave. The train hadn't made any stops yet, and I would have woken up if people had been moving around and exiting the car. The train came to a stop, and the doors opened with their familiar hiss. I expected the old man to get off, but he didn't move. The doors stayed open for the usual 30 seconds, then closed again, and we continued down the tracks. I was starting to feel uneasy. I stood up and walked toward the front of the car, thinking maybe I'd ask the old man if he'd seen where everyone went. As I got closer, I could see that he was very thin, almost skeletal, and his skin had a greyish pallor that looked unhealthy. "Excuse me," I said as I approached his seat. "Did you see what happened to all the other passengers?" The old man slowly turned his head to look at me, and I immediately wished I hadn't spoken to him. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion of his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't get off until I do," he said. "What?" "Don't get off until I do," he repeated, more insistently this time. I backed away from him and returned to my seat, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that maybe I'd imagined how crowded the train was when I first got on. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought, and I'd only dreamed that there were other passengers. But I knew that wasn't true. I distinctly remembered having to look for an empty seat when I boarded. The train made its second stop, and again, the doors opened. I could see the platform. It was completely through the windows, but deserted. No one got on or off. The old man remained in his seat, motionless. As we pulled away from the station, I noticed something else that made my stomach clench with fear. Looking out the windows, I couldn't see any lights from buildings or streetlights. Everything outside was completely dark, like we were traveling through a void. By the time we reached what should have been the third stop, I was in full panic mode. I knew this route by heart, and we should have been passing through the downtown area with its bright lights and late-night businesses. Instead, there was nothing but darkness pressing against the windows. The old man hadn't moved from his seat, but I could feel him watching me. Every time I glanced toward the front of the car, those black eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When we reached my usual stop, I stood up automatically, ready to get off like I did every night. But as I started walking toward the doors, the old man's voice stopped me. "I told you not to get off until I do." His voice was louder now, more commanding, and something in his tone made me freeze in place. The doors opened, and I could see my neighborhood station platform, familiar and well lit. Everything looked normal. I could even see the 24-hour convenience store across the street where I sometimes stopped for snacks. But I didn't get off. Something about the old man's warning kept my feet planted on the floor of the train car. After 30 seconds, the doors closed, and we continued down the tracks. "Good," the old man whispered without turning around. "You're learning." We traveled for what felt like hours, making stops at stations I didn't recognize. Some of the platforms were populated with people, but they weren't normal people. They stood perfectly still, all facing the train, their faces blank and expressionless. Others were completely empty, except for shadows that moved independently of anything that could cast them. Throughout this nightmare journey, the old man remained motionless in his seat. I was too terrified to try to leave the car or even move from my seat. I just sat there, watching the impossible stations go by and wondering if I was losing my mind. Finally, as dawn began to break outside the windows, the train pulled into a station that looked somewhat normal. The old man stood up slowly, his movements stiff and mechanical. As he walked past my seat toward the doors, he paused and looked down at me. "This is where we get off," he said. I followed him off the train, not because I wanted to, but because I felt like I had no choice. The station platform was empty, except for the two of us, and I realized I had no idea where we were. The architecture looked old, like something from the 1940s, and there were no signs indicating the station name. The old man walked toward the exit without looking back. When he reached the turnstiles, he simply vanished, like he'd never been there at all. I was alone on the platform, with no idea how to get home. The train I'd been on was gone, and there was no schedule board indicating when another one might arrive. I walked out of the station and found myself on a street I didn't recognize in a part of the city I'd never seen before. It took me 3 hours and 2 bus transfers to get back to my neighborhood. When I finally made it home, I called in sick to work and spent the day trying to make sense of what had happened. I looked up train schedules and route maps, but I couldn't find any record of the stations I'd seen during that nightmare ride. The next night, I took an earlier train home, one that was crowded with normal passengers who got on and off at normal stops. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the old man was still watching me somehow, waiting for me to make the mistake of getting off before he did. I changed my work schedule after that, switching to day shifts so I wouldn't have to take the late train anymore. Because I have a terrible feeling that if I ever encounter that old man again, I might not be lucky enough to make it home at all. That train ride sounds like the poster accidentally boarded some kind of supernatural transit system that exists parallel to the normal one. The fact that all the other passengers vanished without a trace, and those black-eyed stations populated with motionless figures suggests they were traveling through some kind of liminal space between dimensions. The old man's warning probably saved the poster's life, because getting off at any of those otherworldly stops might have trapped them permanently. The fact that he vanished at the end confirms he wasn't human, just some kind of guide helping lost souls navigate a very dangerous journey. Our next story takes us into the world of new parenthood, where sleepless nights and baby monitors can reveal sounds that shouldn't exist. My daughter Emma was born 3 months premature and spent her first 6 weeks in the NICU before we were finally able to bring her home. As first-time parents, my wife Sarah and I were nervous about everything, constantly checking to make sure Emma was breathing and responding to every little sound she made. We set up a high-tech baby monitor system with video and audio that connected to our phones, so we could keep an eye on Emma even when we were in other parts of the house. The monitor had incredible sensitivity and would pick up the slightest noise from the nursery. During Emma's first week home, everything seemed normal. She cried when she was hungry or needed changing, slept for a few hours at a time, and made all the typical baby sounds. The monitor worked perfectly, alerting us whenever she stirred or made noise. But during her second week home, I started noticing something odd about the audio feed from the monitor. Late at night, when Emma was sleeping soundly, I would hear what sounded like static mixed with very faint voices coming through the speaker. At first, I assumed it was interference from other electronic devices in the house, or maybe picking up signals from neighbors' baby monitors. These things happen with wireless devices, and I didn't think much of it. But the voices became more distinct over the next few nights. They were too quiet to make out words, but they definitely sounded like people talking. Sarah thought I was imagining things because she couldn't hear them, but to me, they were clear as day. On Thursday night, I was sitting in bed, listening to the monitor around 2 in the morning when the static got louder. Emma was fast asleep in her crib, and the video feed showed her lying peacefully on her back. But through the audio, I could hear those voices again, and this time I could make out some words. It sounded like a man singing very softly, almost under his breath. The melody was familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. Then I realized what it was. Rock-a-bye baby, in the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. My blood ran cold. There was definitely a man's voice coming through the monitor, singing a lullaby to my daughter. But according to the video feed, the nursery was empty, except for Emma sleeping in her crib. I grabbed the monitor and ran to Emma's room, bursting through the door and flipping on the lights. Emma woke up and started crying, but there was no one else in the room. I checked the closet, under the crib, behind the changing table, everywhere someone could possibly hide. The room was empty. Sarah came running when she heard Emma crying and me moving around. When I explained what had happened, she looked at the monitor settings and suggested that maybe we were picking up audio from a neighbor's house or from some kind of radio transmission. We moved the monitor base unit to different locations in the room and even changed the channel it was operating on, but the problem persisted. Every night around the same time, I would hear that man's voice singing lullabies through the static. The strange thing was that Emma seemed to respond to it. On the nights when I heard the singing, she would sleep more soundly and for longer periods. It was like someone was actually soothing her to sleep, even though no one was there. After a week of this, I decided to record the audio so I could prove to Sarah that I wasn't imagining things. I used my phone to capture the sound coming from the monitor, and when I played it back the next morning, the singing was clearly audible. Sarah was shaken when she heard the recording. We called the company that made the monitor to ask about possible interference or technical malfunctions, but they insisted their devices were encrypted and couldn't pick up signals from other sources. We decided to have the monitor system professionally inspected, thinking maybe there was some kind of wiring issue or electronic malfunction that could explain the voices. The technicians spent 2 hours going over every component and found nothing wrong. The system was functioning perfectly. That night, I set up a video camera pointed at the monitor itself, while also recording the audio output. I wanted to capture both what was coming through the speaker and see if anything visible was happening to the device when the voices appeared. Around 2:15 in the morning, the static started again. I watched as the monitor's display remained normal, showing Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib. But through the audio, clear as day, came that same man's voice singing another lullaby. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Daddy's gonna buy you a mockingbird." I felt sick. The word daddy hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just random interference or some neighbor's voice bleeding through. Someone was singing to my daughter, calling themselves her daddy. When I reviewed the video recording the next morning, I noticed something that made my hands shake. At the exact moment the singing started, you could see a brief reflection in the black screen of the monitor. It was just for a split second, but it looked like the outline of a man's face. I showed the recording to Sarah, and she saw it too. We called the police immediately. They took our report seriously and sent officers to check the house and surrounding property. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been on our property, and no explanation for what we'd captured on video. The detectives suggested we might be dealing with someone who had advanced electronic equipment and was somehow hacking into our monitor system. He recommended we switch to a different type of monitor and consider installing additional security cameras around the house. We bought a new monitor system that night, a different brand with different technology. For 3 nights, everything was quiet. Emma slept normally, and we heard nothing but the usual household sounds through the audio feed. But on the 4th night, it started again. Same time, same static, same man's voice singing lullabies to our daughter. That's when I realized the voices weren't coming through the monitor at all. They were coming from inside Emma's room. I crept down the hallway and stood outside her door, listening carefully. I could hear the singing, faint but clear, coming from within the nursery. When I opened the door and looked inside, the singing stopped immediately. Emma was awake, looking up at the ceiling with wide eyes, but she wasn't crying or upset. She looked content, like someone had been comforting her. We moved Emma's crib into our bedroom that night and every night after. The singing never happened when she slept in our room, but sometimes, late at night, I could hear it coming from the empty nursery down the hall. A man's voice, singing lullabies to a child who was no longer there. We moved out of that house 2 months later. I never found out who was singing to Emma, or how they were getting into our home without leaving any trace. All I know is that during those weeks when the singing was happening, Emma was the most peaceful, well-rested baby I'd ever seen. Sometimes I wonder if we made a mistake by leaving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was singing to my daughter wasn't entirely human, and I wasn't willing to find out what they wanted in return for those peaceful nights. Wow, what a way to end tonight's collection. If you enjoyed these, don't forget to subscribe for more unsettling tales. Until then, be safe and good night.